There is, in each of us, a voice that speaks our most truthful thoughts. And sometimes it asks us things we don't want to think about. That is the opening line of my new book, What Do You Mean God Speaks? And it is a book version of what we explored mostly in Season 1 of this podcast series. What's that? You never heard that particular opening line in this series so far? Well, if the book and this podcast is exactly the same, what'd be the point of the book? Welcome back to What Do You Mean God Speaks? The series is returning, beginning with a series of bonus episodes before restarting the second half of Season 4, God Awaits in the Desert. So, welcome back, and thank you for waiting. And it was an especially long wait this time. So, what have I been up to lately? Well, back in November of last year, 2024, I completed a proposal for a book based on this podcast series, its first season to be exact, and submitted to a publisher in the US that I've been considering for a while now. And a couple of months later, early this January, I received an offer of publication from them. We're drafting a contract right now, and once that's done, I'll be contracted to complete the full manuscript for the book and send it to them by the end of April, on Easter Day to be exact. Well, assuming nothing else comes up and things go as planned. The rest of the publication process, such as editing, marketing, printing, and so on, will take somewhere around a year or so. Then it will be out in the market. And the working title is, What Do You Mean God Speaks? To God, from our godless world. Either that or, What Do You Mean God Speaks? From a world where God is no more believable than UFOs. What's with the second option? UFOs? What's that about? So that'll be part of today's talk because it has to do with how I came up with this podcast series in the first place. Stuff that happened years before I began this series. You can say that this title is connected to something like the season 0 of this series. Anyway, so who bought the book? I say bought because the publisher essentially buys the rights to publish the book by bearing the cost of the entire publication process, which is not cheap, and paying the author royalties of the future sales. So, which publisher made that offer? And that's another longish story because I've been looking for a very particular kind of publisher for 2 years or so, if you remember that bonus episode way back in 2023. And let me say, it was a challenge. Several times, I looked around and sort of put it on hold because I just couldn't figure out what to do. First, I wanted a publisher that had a certain kind of reach. Now, I have published the book before, as many of you know already, God at the Crossroads of Worldviews, which was a book in philosophy of religion. But that book was what is called a monograph, a book that presents new findings or novel arguments that advances the field of study for which it is written. And that means that it's primarily written for scholars and experts in that field. Now, I did try to write it so that it'll be readable to more general readers, but honestly speaking, at the bare minimum, you probably need to know at least as much as a university student doing a major in these topics. And its contents were fairly difficult too. Now, several listeners have told me that this podcast requires a lot of thinking on their part. It takes a lot of their processing power, so to speak. So they can't just listen to it while doing some other chores or something. But God at the Crossroads of Worldviews dealt with things like the contemporary debate about God, rationality, and truth, as well as philosophical accounts on large-scale reasoning and concept of worldviews. And it also delved into different interpretations on the theological works of figures like Thomas Aquinas, and if you're already lost, then I probably made my point. And I wanted my new book to be, well, easier to read. If God at the Crossroads of Worldviews was aiming to be a book like, say, After Virtue by the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, and don't worry if you don't know who that is, my new book was aiming to be like C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. Not the content per se, though there are some similarities obviously, but really similar level of readership and tone. And that meant that I wanted a publisher to be what's called a popular press. But most of these kinds of presses, really big and well-known ones at least, require an agent to represent the author. You can't just send an idea of the book to them. They wouldn't even read it. And I just couldn't get familiar with that system of finding an agent and so on. Anyway, the other issue was that nowadays, popular presses that publish the kind of topics that this book and this podcast series deals with tend to be quite partisan. So in the specific case of my book, it will mean publishers that want books from a Christian perspective. But those publishers tend to prefer books that are, shall we say, very firmly one-sided in their viewpoints and very strong about it. Maybe you know what I mean. Ones that say it will give you definitive and sometimes even scientific proofs for God and for the Bible and all of those things. Either that or some personal story of how the author met God and how they're now sure about, well, everything. Yeah, I'm exaggerating, but either way, this kind of approach didn't quite fit with what I was doing. And of course, there are plenty of people on the other side who are also so very sure about things, sure that any belief in God is utterly irrational and ignorant, that religion is just evil and purely harmful, and so on. And as far as I'm concerned, they make for very interesting mirror images of the supposedly fanatical religious people that they criticize. But that's another issue. Now, this is not at all to say that having strong views about things and being very sure about your views are a bad thing. By all means, I say go for it. But the kind of readers that I hope to reach are, as this podcast puts it, skeptics who want to understand, Christians who question their beliefs, and everyone in between. It's for people who sort of on the fence and are trying to find their way. People who aren't convinced by the sure answers of either sides. And anyway, I also found that the presses that didn't fit with these kind of readers tended to only want authors they knew and worked with before. Of course, there were academic presses, publishers that want scholarly books, university presses and such. And because they're academic, their books tend to be more balanced. I mean, okay, it's true that scholars or academics can often be quite biased and one-sided even in their expert views, but I'm talking about tendencies and how, comparatively speaking, because of peer reviews perhaps, their work are usually more careful. And of course, I'm also more familiar with academic presses because of my first book. But again, books they prefer tend to be less accessible to the kind of readers that I wanted to reach, and the style and goal of my new book was not quite that of an academic book. Still though, by early 2024, when I had narrowed down the number of potential publishers to something like 4, I still wasn't sure. So 2 of those were university presses. The first was University of Notre Dame Press, since, it published my first book, God at the Crossroads of Worldviews. But I wanted to consult with the editors there first, because I just couldn't shake the thought that the book that I was writing didn't really fit them. Again, I was writing a book like C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. Now I keep mentioning that book since C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity was based on a series of his radio broadcasts. And well, I was writing a book based on a series of my podcast. Though, let's not talk about the difference of popularity between our 2 series, eh? Anyway, the editor agreed. She thought that the book would be interesting. I mean, maybe she was just being polite, but I don't think she'd just say things that she doesn't mean, since that'd be unprofessional. But she did think that it would be more appropriate for a publisher that reached a more general audience. So all this really whittled down the candidates and left 2 publishers. Yes, I know that most authors usually knock on the doors of like a dozen publishers at a time, and that's a minimum. But let's just say that instead of knocking on doors, I spent a lot more time thinking about which door to knock. And before all this, I did upload a proposal to a service that's supposed to reach out to different publishers and agents before I took more time to really identify what kind of publisher that I wanted. And of course, back then, no one showed interest. Though I suppose it could be that the service was kind of shady, but I don't know. Anyway, the first of the two remaining choices was a larger and more popular Christian press. If I named it here, you would most likely have at least heard of it. And it had one imprint that was open for submission. The other imprints under that press only work with authors in their contact list or those who are represented by agents. So I sent this imprint a proposal for my book during the summer. Then I waited and waited, but no response. Still though, this publisher was somewhat of a long shot. It is, as I said, a very widely known press, so that if I got in, it would be good. But in the recent years, that publisher didn't seem very interested in publishing the kind of book that I proposed, at least the imprint that was open for submission. And this interest has to do with another trend that I noticed lately with publishers dealing with topics in religion, generally speaking, and Christianity specifically. They seem to be more interested in hot-button social issues like gender, race, the environment, or politics, who's bad and who's not, and how religion like Christianity are tangled up in all of that. You know, the kind of issues that tend to set your SNS accounts on fire, like lead to toxic exchanges on your Twitter. Alright, it's X now, except that it really isn't. Anyway, my book was more, shall we say, broader sweep of the more fundamental big questions that form your entire worldview, that kind of thing. That is, after all, the question of God, what it means to believe in God in the first place, to say that God speaks, and so on. And I think most publishers consider questions like that to have been bottomed out, so to speak. Too many books out by too many people, and nothing new is likely to come up. So they think. And in fact, the first publisher that I sent my proposal to, the one that didn't reply to my submission at all, quite specifically stated that they prefer the hot-button social issues topic. Well, they didn't say that in so many words. What it said, not the exact words, but I'm paraphrasing, was something like they're looking for reflections on how Christianity relates to relevant issues of society today. Either way, their demand did not match my supply. So this left only one more publisher, my second choice. It published books that were academic, yet written for a general audience. And because it sort of straddled the border between scholarly and popular readers, it did publish books that were less, let's say, one-sided and partisan, at least in the kind of questions that I will be exploring in my book. And this publisher was Riffenstock, and I was aiming specifically for its Cascade Books imprint. It publishes books in philosophy, religious history, Christian theology, spirituality, and cultural criticism. And it seeks to be scholarly yet widely readable. As I said, it straddles the border between the two. And Riffenstock is still relatively small and new, as in it's only about 30 years old instead of, say, 100 years, which are typical of well-known and established companies. But I have found repeatedly that its name consistently came up among the different lists of recommended publishers to look into, at least in topics that I was writing about. But of course, will Riffenstock really want a book like the one I was proposing at this particular time? And even if they did, would they want a book that's written by me rather than someone else? See, in the marketplace, the raw odds of a book being picked up by a publisher, generally speaking, is, let's just say, you'll likely have better odds of winning in a casino. Unless your book is really outstanding. But who would send their book thinking that it was terrible? But if my proposal was declined here too, I wouldn't know where else I would go. I would have to do my search all over again, and I was not looking forward to that. There was a reason why it took such a long time for me to narrow down the choices in the first place. So it took some time before I worked up the courage to write something up and send it to them. Yeah, you need to tailor your presentation of the book to each publisher. Anyway, that was November. That's what I was doing then. And this January, Riffenstock made the offer for the book to be published by its Cascade imprint. So they're the publisher. That is, they will be once they go through with the offer and send me the formal contract. And then I fulfill my side of the said contract and finish the book. And if you don't run into any problems and the whole thing is brought to print or ebook or other mediums, then they will be the publisher. Yes, I tend to not count my chickens before they hatch. Even when cracks appear and it starts chirping, I still need to see those little yellow birdies wobble about and then be tucked into some safe corner away from falcons, foxes, felines, and other felons, and then I will count them. Okay then, what's with the proposed title? The second one, I mean. From a world where God seems no more believable than UFOs? That's a mouthful. Well, to my defense, that's a subtitle. The title is, What Do You Mean God Speaks? Like the series. Anyway, the UFO part has to do with how I identify the underlying question that our society, most contemporary modernized societies in fact, have in regard to God. It goes back, I suppose, to the question that I dealt with in God at the Crossroads of Worldviews. But to put it more simply here, I can word the question this way. What does it mean to not believe in God? And of course, long-time listeners may at this point remember that I raised that exact question back in Season 3 in the first episode. But that episode explored how we as a civilization forgot what it actually means to believe in God by forgetting how we actually perceive God. It was about what sort of things happened in our minds so that some of us came to not believe in God. For here, though, I was asking a more immediate question, which was, if I don't believe in God, how do I see the world? And how would I tend to understand what God even means? I was thinking back to how I was when I was an agnostic, or what is sometimes called negative or soft atheist. Because not everyone who don't believe in God positively say that there is no such thing as God. We are quieter than that. And not just because we don't want to offend anyone, though that may be a part of it. Our unbelief tend to be more, how shall I say it, passive. Then I thought of something. Well, let me read a short excerpt of my book here. It's the opening passage, one that follows a sentence that I read at the start. There is in each of us a voice that speaks our most truthful thoughts, and sometimes it asks us things we don't want to think about. And it spoke up while I was watching the Pentagon UFO videos. It asked, do you now believe that there are aliens visiting our planet? No, I answered. I need something much more than this. But it pressed me. So what is that something? I found myself oddly annoyed and replied, why does that matter? This is not a pressing matter in my life right now. Still, the voice persisted. Well then, what is the difference between you not believing in alien UFOs and others not believing in God? I was about to dismiss that question as silly. For God, there's a long history of profound experiences, rational arguments, moral and social. Then something else spoke. And it spoke with more than words, a sense, a necessity. You need to properly answer this question. There is in each of us a voice that speaks our most truthful thoughts. I won't say this is God speaking, not yet. But it does point beyond itself toward that direction. What I learned when I faced that question head on is that why I don't believe in UFOs is actually quite similar to why many people today don't believe in God. I don't mean that we have the same reasons, obviously, but the way we sort of justify our views, or rather our lack of views or lack of belief, those are similar. Here's what I mean. I don't actually know whether there are alien UFOs or not. I don't look up cases of UFO sightings and try to prove them or disprove them. If I got into an argument with a UFO enthusiast and they list all of these cases, I wouldn't know how to answer them. And there are times when some case catches my attention and, honestly speaking, disturbs me. That was what happened when I was watching the Pentagon UFO videos, when I watched those flight recordings of US jet fighters encountering anomalous phenomena, or UFOs really, and the pilot's nervous comments about them. And when I read the news that it was part of an official congressional hearing, and that experts can't explain what these jet fighters encountered, I really did think then that maybe there really are aliens visiting our planet. what stopped me from believing? Well, I also read afterwards that there are other potential explanations, natural phenomena, something that can cause sensors to glitch and so on. Now, we couldn't be sure about it, and the Pentagon briefing did imply that they cannot completely rule out extraterrestrials, but the conclusion really was that there were no real evidence that these really are alien UFOs. That is, the world basically said, well, that's interesting. We don't know what that is. But so far, it doesn't seem like something we need to worry about, and then went on its daily business. But the question does sit at the back of our heads. I don't think it's somehow impossible that we'll one day meet aliens from outer space. Part of me don't want that. It would turn our world upside down. But part of me think that it would be exciting and interesting. There are conflicting attitudes even within a single person, namely myself. But it doesn't really matter. Our world is running fine without any alien UFOs, and periodic strange cases are just that, strange cases, anomalies. Unless something bigger happens and upends our world, like, say, UFOs landing in our backyards, I can just live without dealing with it. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm not interested or completely closed to the idea of UFOs. It's just that it's not a part of my world, and the reasons and arguments to believe in UFOs are simply not enough to break into that world. I know there are people who believe in UFOs. I know they have reasons to. I'm not positively saying that they're all crazy, though a lot of them do seem to be. And I do think some of them had genuine life-changing experiences. But I also know that there are, say, psychological explanations for those experiences. Whether that's what they are, I don't actually know, again. But yet again, not a part of my world. So, very, very simply put, I don't have to deal with them. And I realize that this is very similar to how most of those who don't believe in God today think about the question of God. For those of us who don't believe, it's not that we would positively say that there is no such thing as God. Some of us may, but most of us don't. And most people wouldn't even be able to really defend why they don't believe in God when they're, say, debating against a Christian apologist who lists philosophical or moral or even scientific reasons why we should believe in God. But rather like how I sort of glanced over at other experts who said that the Pentagon UFO videos don't really prove that aliens are visiting our planet, we also may reassure ourselves that those arguments from believers haven't completely convinced the other experts. Again, the world seems to say to us, well, okay, at least some of those points are fair, but you don't really have to change your views yet. And it's not even that people are completely uninterested in the questions about God, faith, or spirituality. It's just that God seems to not be a part of our lives. The world seems to kind of go on without this God thing. Or as this podcast series put it in its very first episode, God seems nowhere to be found in our world. And that's because it seems that there is no job for God. God is like alien UFOs in that those of us who don't believe don't feel the need to deal with that question at all most of our lives. And like how I can defer the real and very important question of, are we alone in the universe? Is there anybody else out there? Until something happens to us, like, say, UFOs landing in our backyards, or I hear maybe the discovery of extraterrestrial life in the news, and how until then I can ignore all the stuff about UFOs and aliens visiting our planet as, if not outright crazy talk or flights of fancy, at least something that I just don't have to pay serious attention to my life. Sort of like that, those of us who don't believe in God feel the same about God. And it isn't just the atheists or those with no religion who can feel this way. Those of us who do belong to some religious faith, like Christianity or Judaism or Islam or other such religions, and even those of us who go to church regularly, say, can struggle with these same kind of questions. The world we live and what we say we believe don't seem to match. We say we believe God, but we don't know how to find that God. God seems as alien to us as UFOs. Or perhaps we do believe and truly feel that God is real, but our world that seems so obviously filled with God's presence is not the world that people around us seem to experience, and we don't quite understand why. We don't know where the chasm between us lies, where they're coming from. And that's what my book is for. In fact, that is why this podcast series began. That is why the very first episode of the first season began with a question, why there is no job for God. But again, using our analogy of UFOs, what my book and this podcast series is asking is this. Why do we even think that God is something rather like alien UFOs? Maybe we got confused about what it actually means to believe in God. Maybe we got something mixed up. Maybe we got confused. Maybe we've forgotten what God even means, what it means for God to meet us, to speak to us. Maybe we should again ask ourselves, and to those who have believed, what do you mean God speaks? And that's this podcast. And I'm refining, expanding, and consolidating what we explored here to publish as a book. Hopefully the first book of the series, though that would probably depend on how well this book will be received. That is, how well it's sold, to be rather blunt about it. Anyway, so until the end of April, I will be writing, or rather rewriting the scripts of this series into a book, which is why until then, I'll do a sporadic bonus episodes, or at least try to. So I apologize that this is not really a full return. Now, I have been writing the next regular episode, but then I realized that if I complete that and upload that, it will be a while once again for the next episode. And you might have noticed that the episode about the Passover lamb last year was something of a milestone in the series. It sort of pointed to the series' eventual goal of exploring the gospel of Jesus Christ. So it was more of a natural place to place a kind of pause there. The next episode is actually a lead up to the second half of the season. So I was thinking that I want to start that when I'm ready to put more focus on the podcast after I finish the manuscript for the book. So again, thank you for listening. And still, please join me for further episodes, even the bonus episodes. Right now, I'm thinking of presenting the parts of the podcast episodes that were never aired, because there's quite a few bits that I often leave out of each episode. Thank you for all your support. Last year has been quite an uphill struggle, to be honest, but with hopefully the book on the way, we'll continue our journey. Because we've still got a long way to go. And as always, please follow, subscribe, and share this series with others. And rate it on your Apple Podcasts and Spotify and other platforms that let you do so. Your support keeps us going. Not just the podcast, but now, even the book.